So today I want to go over one of the most important pieces of Diablo 4 in dungeons. And there's actually been some pretty massive changes to dungeons in the past couple weeks, so we have a ton of new information to go over as well. Now, dungeons are going to serve two primary phases. First off, being just normal dungeons that you're going through and completing while going through the main campaign and getting into World Tier 3. But once you get into the end game and get into World Tier 3, you're primarily going to be doing Nightmare dungeons, which are the end game version of the dungeon system. Now, the basis of these dungeons are actually going to be a bit unique to the Diablo franchise, because instead of being fully randomly generated pieces of content, such as something like Rifts from Diablo 3, these are going to be physical places in the open world that you have to travel to enter, and all the dungeons are going to be their own unique experience. So if you go in one dungeon, you're going to know you're in that specific dungeon. They're all going to have their own identity. So every dungeon is only going to have a certain amount of monster families in them, usually one or two, and every dungeon is also going to have their own different layouts and objectives. Now, even though all these dungeons are their own bespoke piece of content, they're still going to have some amount of randomization. So they're going to have differences in where enemies spawn, in the packs of enemies that are spawning, and then they're going to have some randomization in the actual layout of the dungeon. Now, if you compared Diablo 4's dungeons to more randomized pieces of content from previous Diablo games, they would seem quite a bit less replayable, but there's going to be over 100 dungeons on launch of Diablo 4. I think it's somewhere around 115 dungeons, and then add in a few more for Capstone Dungeons that we're also going to go over in this video. So that means that singular dungeons aren't going to give you as much replayability, but you're going to have so many dungeons as a whole that you're going to have a lot higher replayability than you had in systems from previous Diablo games. And going through these dungeons, you're going to have to complete a somewhat randomized objective, and the dungeon usually ends with a boss fight. Some of the dungeons just end after you complete a handful of activities, but most of the dungeons you're completing an objective to get to the boss at the end. And one of the really good things about Diablo 4 has been the boss fights, and a lot of these boss fights at the end of these dungeons actually have pretty important mechanics you actually have to play around. And this does end up giving you some pretty fun and challenging boss fights with how slow and methodical Diablo 4's combat is. And this is primarily how you're going to be interacting with dungeons as you go throughout the main campaign of the game. Now, once you've completed the main campaign, then you can start progressing into the end game. And the first thing you're going to need to do is complete a Capstone Dungeon to unlock World Tier 3. Now, Capstone Dungeons are going to be a much more difficult version of the normal dungeons in the game. And you're also going to have to defeat a more challenging boss within that dungeon as well. So these are kind of souped up dungeons in every way, and they're supposed to be as difficult or more difficult than the world tier you're unlocking by defeating them. So to get into World Tier 3, you have to do a Capstone Dungeon. Then to get into World Tier 4, you have to do another Capstone Dungeon. Now, once you complete that Capstone Dungeon and get into World Tier 3, you can now start to obtain Nightmare Sigils for the Nightmare Dungeon system. Now, this system is essentially obtaining dungeon keys to turn dungeons into endgame versions. So you get a Nightmare Sigil that's a key to a specific dungeon in the world, and this is going to turn that dungeon into a Nightmare Dungeon. It's going to add different affixes to that dungeon to make it more difficult, but it's also going to give you more and better loot. And the primary way we know of to get these Nightmare Sigils is through the Tree of Whispers system, which is essentially the bounty system of Diablo 4. You go complete bounties in the world, you get a different type of currency. When you have enough of that currency, you turn it into the tree, you get some loot, and that's a primary way you're going to be getting these Nightmare Sigils. Now, if you don't like the sigils you're getting, you can also deconstruct them to get another resource that will then allow you to craft more Nightmare Sigils to try to get ones you like more. And the Nightmare Dungeon system is going to be one of the most important systems in the game for farming end game loot, and is pretty clearly where the team put a lot of their effort into, just because of how many dungeons there are, and having its own system that gives you some choice on what actual content you're trying to go and complete to get gear from. And these Nightmare Sigils are actually tiered off into different tiers, and essentially this is just the higher tier. The higher difficulty the sigil is going to be. So it may add more affixes or not allow you to revive as many times within that dungeon run. And one of the things the developers mentioned with this Nightmare Dungeon system is that they want you to actually be able to choose what Nightmare Dungeons you go and try to complete. They want to give you enough of these sigils so you can actually have a choice on, is that dungeon good for your build? Is that Nightmare Sigil good for your build? And if it's not, you can skip that one and deconstruct it or put it in your stash to go do it a different time or on a different character, and to choose the sigils that you think are going to be good for your build. And we actually got a look at some of these sigils from the most recent developer live stream, which did give us some new information. So we got some different examples. First off, being a tier 3 Nightmare Sigil, then a tier 17 Nightmare Sigil, then a tier 29 Nightmare Sigil. And one of the biggest differences between these is, first off, the amount of times you can revive in the dungeon. So the tier 3 and 17 both had 12 revives, but at the tier 29, which was also in World Tier 4, you could only have 4 revives. So it seems like once you get up into World Tier 4, you can only revive 4 times in these Nightmare Dungeons, so they're going to become much more difficult. But one of the other big differences is how many affixes the dungeons have. So with the tier 3, there was 2 affixes that play against you and 1 affix that's in your favor. And the affix in your favor are colored green. So this one increases your lightning damage, but the affixes against you are nightmare portals and monsters doing additional shadow damage. And these nightmare portals were also recently shown off. These are essentially portals that can spawn in the dungeon, that can spawn enemies from any enemy faction in the game. So this can actually change up how you have to go about completing this dungeon quite heavily, because the monster families in the game are all going to be very different. So you might get a monster family that spawns in that's very good against whatever build you're currently using, that could potentially screw up that Nightmare Dungeon run. Now, going up to this tier 19 sigil, there's 3 affixes against you and 1 working for you. So the one for you is reduced cooldowns on kill, but against you, we have Blood Blister, monster attack speed, and monster vulnerable resist. And we don't exactly know what all of these are yet, but you can get a decent idea of what they are. But then once we get up to the tier 29 sigil that's in World Tier 4, there's 4 affixes against you and still only 1 working for you. So this should give you a pretty good idea of how normal and Nightmare Dungeons are going to work. Now, one of the things not shown on these Nightmare Sigils themselves is how much additional loot or how much higher quality loot we're actually going to be getting. Hopefully, once you get in the dungeon or once you go put in this Nightmare Sigil, hopefully it does give you more information on this dungeon and how much additional loot you're going to be getting from doing these much harder versions of these dungeons. And we've also pretty recently got a big piece of information on how Nightmare Dungeons and Sigils are going to work in future seasons. So with every future season in Diablo 4, only 30 of the dungeons in the game are going to be active to be Nightmare Dungeons. So you're only going to be able to get Nightmare Sigils for those 30 dungeons with every new season. And I think they're taking a play out of World of Warcraft's most recent expansion with this, changing up the dungeons that every new season allows you to progress into. And personally, I'm also a fan of this system because this does change up the dungeons you're actually going to be able to do, and this is going to force you to play some different dungeons every season. If they just allowed every single dungeon, people would very quickly find the most optimal dungeons, and people would just go do that dungeon or that handful of dungeons every season. So it's nice that they're switching up the Nightmare Dungeons you're actually able to do with every new season, because I think it's going to add a lot more variety. Now, we don't know if there's going to be new dungeons added with any new seasons. I would probably only expect that if the new seasonal system is somehow tied into this new specific dungeon. And there's actually been some pretty massive changes to dungeons since the first public betas, because some of the biggest complaints from those betas had to do with dungeons, primarily based around backtracking and the objectives in these dungeons being very samey. And there's a pretty long list of changes to dungeons, but some of the bigger ones started off with increasing the chance for events to spawn in dungeons from 10 to 60%, meaning you're going to be coming across these different events in dungeons a lot of the time now, and completing these events gives you a chest with a lot of additional loot and the gambling currency, which will just allow you to target farm loot a bit more easily. Another one of the big changes being a change in how the dungeons were randomly generated, specifically when talking about pathing, because a lot of times in these dungeons, one of the objectives would be basically go to all 3 corners of this dungeon and kill something or pick something up to complete the objective of that dungeon to go fight the boss. And usually you'd have to end up backtracking through the entirety of the dungeon, potentially multiple times, and they gave a bunch of examples of how they're changing this up, so now the dungeons should randomize in much smarter ways so there's not near as much backtracking. So as you progress through the dungeon, you should come across the objectives you're trying to complete. Then they also added in some additional objectives and made a lot of the already existing objectives much easier to deal with, and even added a lot of additional features to these objectives to make some of them even fun. For example, some of the dungeons in the beta, you would have to go in and collect animus from elite enemies in the dungeon. So you'd kill these elites and they would drop these orbs you would step on to fill up your animus bar that allowed you to get to the next part of the dungeon. So now they added, whenever you pick up this animus, you gain 10 of your resource and you reduce all of your ability cooldowns by 1 second. So this is going to speed up the combat of the dungeon, speed up you completing the objective, and just make that dungeon much more fun in general, because now you're just reducing your cooldowns, getting a ton of additional resources, which will also probably allow you to pull a lot more of the dungeon at a time. And there's a lot more changes they did to dungeons, but pretty much all of these changes I would consider to be positive, and I'm very surprised they actually changed up these dungeons this much from those public betas, because they did quite a lot off of player feedback. And I think in general, dungeons are going to be in a pretty good spot when Diablo 4 is officially released. And the last piece of dungeons we have to go over is the Codex of Power. Now, how this is going to work is the first time you complete pretty much every dungeon in the game, you're going to unlock a codex in the Codex of Power. Now, this is essentially you permanently unlocking a legendary aspect that you can apply to as many rare or legendary gear pieces as you want. Now, these are going to work basically the same way other legendary powers work, but instead of pulling a legendary power from a piece of gear and putting it on another piece of gear, you're instead just applying one of these aspects from your Codex of Power into that piece of gear. And all you need to do is complete a dungeon, you get that codex for that specific power, and you just have it forever, and it's unlocked on your whole account. Now, there's 2 big downsides with this Codex of Power. First off, every legendary power is not going to be in the codex. I think there's only going to be around half of the powers in the actual codex, so there's still a lot you have to go hunt for on pieces of gear, and all of the powers in the codex are the lowest rolled versions of the legendary powers. So legendary powers in Diablo 4 have a roll range just like normal affixes. So maybe that power can roll 10 to 20%. But if you use the power from the codex, it'll always be the lowest. So if it could roll from 10 to 20%, the codex would always give you a 10% roll. But the Codex of Power is still going to play a massive role in gearing up once you get into the endgame and as you're going throughout the campaign. And since this is going to be a seasonal game, it's going to play a massive role in every new season as well. Because if you have all these aspects in the codex that are infinite use, you can very easily get low rolled versions of most of the legendary powers you're looking for right off the bat. You can just throw them on a bunch of rare pieces you've obtained, and now you have a lot of the legendary powers you were looking for just at a lower power level, which is going to allow you to much more easily farm up gear to try to get better rolled versions of the powers you're using. But that's pretty much all I want to go over for dungeons, so thanks for watching.